G'day guys, I'm going to be speaking to Zohran Mamdani. He won the Democratic primary for the 36th Assembly District, which covers Astoria. Good morning, Zohran. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, Christian.
No, thank you. So, Zohran, tell us a little bit about yourself. For people that don't know you, you've clearly taken Astoria, by storm in many ways. So just tell those that don't really know you about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Zohran Mamdani. I was born and raised in Kampala, Uganda, in East Africa, and I moved to New York City with my family at the age of 7. And prior to being a candidate for office, I was a foreclosure prevention housing counselor. So what that means is that I worked in Jackson Heights and Richmond Hill with low to moderate income families who were facing eviction from their long-time homes, usually as a result of issues stemming from loss of employment, healthcare emergency, or unforeseen family emergency. And so in my work with those clients across the borough of Queens, as well as the experiences I've seen in my friends and others in our neighborhood as being tenants, I've seen the ways in which the housing crisis has really uprooted so many people across this borough, across the city, and across the state. And so that is in large part why this campaign was built around the issue of housing.
Right, okay. So, Zohran, what will you bring to Albany? And what's different from, the current assembly person that you bring?
I think I bring a couple of things. One is I bring my expertise as having been a counselor, and I bring my expertise as having worked with people who are being directly impacted by this crisis. And the reason that I bring that up is that oftentimes when we talk about the housing crisis, we think about it in the sense of a binary, that you are either in support of tenants or you're in support of small landlords. And my work was exclusively with low to middle income homeowners, many of whom would rent out a unit or 2 units in order to pay their mortgage. And my understanding of the housing crisis is one that doesn't fall neatly into that binary, but it's one that understands that this crisis is being fueled in many ways by large-scale financial capital and investors. And I bring that up because when you're able to better identify the roots of this crisis, then I think you're able to better address the ways in which we can resolve it. And so what I'm going to Albany to do is to fight for universal rent control. A piece of legislation called good cause eviction will make that into a reality. And the really interesting and exciting thing about that legislation is that it helps both tenants and small landlords by fighting back against large-scale capital. And I think that my experience will be able to make a convincing case for that legislation. I think additionally, what I also bring is a willingness to really critique the entire system of government and the way in which our politics has been set up, not exclusive to something that also includes the Democratic Party as we've had it in Albany. And much of this campaign was not only a critique of my opponent in the race, but very much about the system of politics here in Queens with the Democratic Party, but also in Albany with regards to how legislation is put on the floor and the ways in which leadership determines much of what gets to pass and what doesn't.
Yeah, one thing I find very baffling about Albany, even as a foreigner myself, is how so much of the legislation is done through the budget as opposed to through a standard parliamentary procedure. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's ridiculous. I think that so much of what happens in Albany is it needs to change drastically. And I think that it is very, very hard for someone to stay up to date on what their legislators are doing and what kind of legislation is being pushed and what is being passed, because, as you said, so much of it isn't being done in a kind of clear parliamentary, almost a little more transparent system, but rather it's being negotiated in a very small period of time where the governor has a truly disproportionate amount of power in pushing through what will become legislation and reality here in New York State.
Okay. Well, listen, a big component of your policies, like most progressives that have, done very well recently, is criminal justice reforms. And part of that too, of course, is police funding. Now, I saw in your platform you talk about, a $3 billion cut to the NYPD, I assume. So how would you do that? And what would you say to naysayers that say, oh, listen, budget cuts to the NYPD correlates to a rise in crime? What are your thoughts on those on that issue and your critics potentially?
Yeah, I think so. First and foremost, we put that policy out there, and we made we made it very clear when messaging around it that this is something that I believe and that we stand for, but also simultaneously something that is not actually within the purview of the state legislature. The funding of the NYPD is controlled by the city council,
Right.
And this is an issue that will frame, I think, a lot of the races in this upcoming year, which are, going to be, I think 70% of the city council is term limited.
Yeah.
And so across this entire city, I think we were seeing more than 500 candidates already. Now, but the part of the reason that I spoke up about that is because I think that the old style of politics where you only speak to your technical purview or your lane is one that we must leave in the past, because it's very important to understand that one of elected officials' many powers is the bully pulpit that comes with their position, and to make it very clear that when we have a vision for a society, we must fight for it across every single section of it. So just because the state assembly can't legislate on it doesn't mean that I shouldn't make clear that this is how I feel about what our city should be doing. Now, with the issue of cutting the budget and the idea that would somehow be tied to rising crime, I think that what we've seen in New York City is that crime rates and NYPD budgets do not directly link up. In I think it was 2015, we had New York City's crime rate was at historic lows, and the city council voted to increase funding to the NYPD, I think, by a substantial amount. And what I think that example really shows for me is that a lot of times the discourse is driven not by facts, but by narratives that are built upon, what has been pushed for decades in our city and in our state regarding the ways in which we must deal with crime. So when we talk about cutting $3 billion from the NYPD, or cutting any amount for that matter, typically what people say is, this is going to make us less safe. And what I would like to make very clear is I am not in any way less interested in safety than people who are unwilling to cut the budget. I would say I'm just as willing, and frankly, maybe even more so, dedicated to this issue, to the extent that I am not wedded to the ways in which we've understood safety in the past. I think that we need to understand safety in the way that people actually experience it. And what I mean by that is, how does it make people safe when they don't have housing? How does it make people safe when they don't have a job? How does it make people safe when we cut funding of essential city services that keep our neighborhoods running?
Mm-hmm.
And too often we associate safety exclusively with policing. And I think that is a flawed association. And so what I would say is that, you look at the indicators of crime, oftentimes it's tied far closer to things like having employment than it is to how many cops are on the beat. And what I would say is when we cut $3 billion or however much we can get cut, whether it's more, or less, that is not just money that is cut and then disappears. It is money that is cut and then reinvested into other social services that I would argue far better create safety.
Okay. Well, that also ties into, we're talking about justice reform, but in terms of inmate population, that is another item that you've sort of raised, maybe reducing the population, of prisoners, maybe because you might see it as a little draconian and not terribly helpful. So what can you talk to that? Because I guess the critics would also argue, well, that too is a cause of potential crime. So just tell us about your thoughts on that, Zohran.
Yeah, I think that, I just zoom out and talk about what my thoughts on prisons are in general. And I think that if you look at the way that prisons are set up in our society, I would argue that they do not work. They do not make us safer. People do not come out of prison, the issues that lead people to go into prison are not resolved by the institution. And then when they return from it, it is not something that is in the past. Oftentimes prison actually exacerbates those issues. And so there are a lot of people who, when they see something, the instinct is to just take that person, the source of that harm, the source of that issue, and then just throw them away, put them in a cage and throw away the key. And that doesn't address the reason why that harm was created in the first place. A lot of times, people who create trauma for others are those who themselves went through trauma earlier in their own lives.
Right.
And I bring all of this up to say that, again, like when we talk about policing, I don't think the system actually makes us safer. I think what it does is it just removes problems out of view. It just makes what should be something that we should deal with, makes it into someone else's issue. And what I think we really need to do is ask ourselves, what does the prison system do? Does it actually reduce harm? And what are alternatives that could actually do that? I would argue that the answer to the second question is that no, it does not, and that the alternatives are things that we must look to immediately, both with regards to neighborhood groups who do anti-violence work and are shown to be more effective than the police, but also asking, if we have an understanding that our criminal justice system is racist, which is quite a general understanding now, it seems to be shared by many, many people, then how can we simultaneously be investing in it as the way we both judge and determine the futures of so many people in our state?
Okay, I understand. Housing is an area that you're obviously very, very familiar. It's your sweet spot, one could argue. What do you? I mean, you're putting forward the notion of rent control across the entire market. Is that correct? How would that work exactly?
So basically, the legislation that I spoke of earlier, good cause eviction, that is a piece of legislation that would create the frameworks for universal rent control. So what I mean by that is that right now in Queens, about half of tenants across our borough are market rate tenants. So they do not have many of the tenant protections that rent stabilized or rent controlled tenants have.
Right.
What I mean by that is there's nothing stopping a landlord of a market rate unit increasing the rent by however much they want at the end of a lease. Right now, all they have to do is notify you at a certain point that they're doing it, but there's nothing stopping them. Additionally, there's nothing stopping a landlord from refusing to renew your lease. They don't have to have any kind of reason. They can just choose not to do so.
Yeah.
What this legislation would do is it would ensure that for a landlord to not offer you a lease renewal, they would have to have just cause.
Like with stabilization. Yeah.
Yes, that they would, if their family is moving in, or if they themselves are coming back, those are kinds of just cause reasonings. But in terms of we want to renovate it so that we can increase the price and get more profit out of this, that's not a just cause. Okay. And what it would also do is tie acceptable rent increases to an inflation index. And if the landlord asks for more than that amount, so let's say, for example, I think right now it's around 3%, then they would have to go in front of a judge and argue their case. So what this would do is provide protections for these tenants. And what we're seeing here in Astoria, we have been seeing a housing crisis in this neighborhood prior to the pandemic. About 24% of all Astoria tenants have been spending more than half of their income on rent. And that is something that really shows how widespread this crisis is. And the fact that evictions, oftentimes when you talk about evictions, people think about it as a marshal coming in, taking you out of your home. But what I would argue is that evictions are also when your landlords increase your rent by an amount that they know is impossible for you to meet, but they do it so that you will leave and then they can get another tenant who can pay that much more. And so the neighborhood continues to lose what makes it the place that we call our home.
Right. Okay, so you'd be talking about units that would be less than 6 in a building, which would be the small guys, and then you'd be talking like in Long Island City where you've got, I mean, I know it's outside your area, but it's easy in the sense of you've got these gigantic TF Cornerstone and related buildings. How would they view it, like your TF Cornerstones and your relateds, if you did put it, obviously this would be state legislation, so it would affect them. How are they greeting this?
Yeah, I think typically, you get what I'm really excited about going to Albany for is that typically the pushback about good cause eviction is that it will impact brown and black homeowners who rent out units in order to pay their mortgage and build up their equity and wealth, which has been, an opportunity for which has been robbed from them by the racist nature of our society and our economic system. And why I talked about my experience as a counselor being so important to the work I will do as a legislator is because I worked with those very homeowners. And this legislation exempts homeowners who live in their properties and rent, and the properties are between 1 and 3 units.
Right.
And so why that's so important is that this legislation understands that the source of the crisis is not the small landlord that is typically used as a defense by Revney. The source of this crisis is large-scale capital. The source of this crisis is, these investor portfolios and, massive corporations who come into neighborhoods, buy up these buildings, get loans from banks on the premise and understanding that they will jack up the rents to be able to pay for the interest they've agreed to. Mm-hmm. And when you put these kinds of limitations on their ability to extract profit from tenants, it also disincentivizes them from buying these properties in the first place. So right now in Astoria, 1 in 4 homes is being bought by an unnamed investor. And a lot of times we talk about the ways in which our neighborhoods are changing. And what we do is we actually attack people who are moving into the neighborhoods as opposed to the people who are facilitating these moves. Mm. And so we attack that which we can see as opposed to that which is making this possible. And so, it is very important for us to pass legislation that will clamp down on the rampant speculation in our neighborhoods. And that's why when I'm talking about this, I'm not only pushing for good cause eviction, I'm pushing for something known as a flip tax, which would put a 15% tax on somebody who buys a home and then sells it to a non-family member within a calendar year. Because that's what's also happening. You have a lot of neighborhoods. This is less so in Astoria, but definitely in Eastern Queens, where you have a lot of neighborhoods where people come in, they buy homes only to flip them. So streets which used to have bustling, community of a neighborhood, then just become skeleton properties for people waiting to flip at the right time.
Yeah, okay. Like short-term capital gains tax or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, interesting platform of yours is transportation. If I read it correctly, you're talking about free fares, funded by, say, Wall Street. You also talk about making greater space available for cyclists and pedestrians, maybe having a few streets that maybe a car free. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, Zohran?
Absolutely. Yes, I think that public transit should be free. Mm-hmm. I think that and the reason I think that, we haven't explicitly said it, but I am a socialist. Mm. And what I mean by that is that I believe that we should live in a society where whatever is required for a dignified life be provided to each and every resident of the state. And that the state should ensure that it is provided. And typically when you talk about socialism, you talk about housing, healthcare, and education are typically thought of as the big three. But when we talk about dignity in our day and age, we understand in the pandemic, you can't live a dignified life without internet. You can't live a dignified life if you're unable to move within your own city. And so I think that, much of what has been attempted with regards to keeping public transit affordable, it speaks to that understanding, that everyone must be able to do it. And what I would say is that we must go beyond kind of approaches that understand the issue but only address some of it, like fair fares, where we have subsidized fares for lower income New Yorkers, and make it free entirely and pay for it through taxation. Because we've just seen the buses weren't collecting fares, and the ridership of them was much higher than what it is right now, which is they've just resumed fare collection and they've seen a massive drop. And what we need to do, not only for economic justice, but also for climate justice, is incentivize public transit to the most that we can, because it is not only critical to dignity, it is also critical to our living in this earth for many decades to come, that we disincentivize private transit and fully incentivize public transit because of the impacts with regards to carbon emissions and such.
Right.
And then you had also asked about bikes and streets. I think that's part and parcel of it. How do we incentivize and encourage zero carbon kind of transit? And I think that it's very important that we not only make biking safe for those who are currently biking, but that we also encourage as many New Yorkers to do so. And the beauty of living in living on a planet where there are other countries that are facing the same problems, is you can see the ways in which they have addressed this issue. And there are so many places and cities that across the world have implemented fantastic cycling infrastructure that makes biking not only possible, but practical. I bike every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need to do is we need to have bike lanes that are not only just painted on the street, but have infrastructure so that we don't require policing to make it usable, and that we can ensure that people feel safe when they bike.
Mm.
And I think that, here in Astoria, we have a number of transit options. Obviously, we need to improve them immensely. But I bring it up to say that there are parts of Queens where there are transit deserts entirely. And to move around requires private transit. And what we need to do is deal with all of these issues simultaneously. We need to both push to further pedestrianize, have open streets and bike lanes, and simultaneously create additional public transit options. So for those members of our neighborhood and our borough, that they must actually have access to that transit so that they can use it. Because this is not a simple issue. In New York City, especially in the outer boroughs, it is not a simple issue of class with regards to who owns cars. There is a blurring of that in transit deserts. And so I think we need to address that as well.
Okay. Now, in terms of potential streets that you could close down or change, are there any in Astoria that are on your radar at this point, or are you just sort of looking at it more of a holistic sense?
I think that there are a number, a number of community organizers and activists mobilized, two in particular, there's McCartney Morris and Evie Hanzopoulos, I think, came together to really take the lead on making 31st Avenue into an open street.
Mm-hmm.
And right now what we have is 31st Avenue between 31st Street and about 36th Street from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. is partially closed to cars. And that is something that, this is one of the first times that I've seen us do this in Astoria. In Ditmars, there's also, over the weekend, there are partial closures of the street on Ditmars. And I think that what we need to do is, initiatives and ensure that we are providing that we as a city and as a state are allowing organizers to provide the programming that will bring people on the street and will allow people to reimagine what these streets could be. I think outdoor dining has done that somewhat for people to reimagine how space could be allocated. And you think about a parking space for one car could seat, 3 or 4 tables, which could give, something to 10 to 12 people. And thinking about how much better it could be utilized, there was a big article in the Times about how we could utilize space with regards to cars and parking. But I think, you also look to other neighborhoods and you see like 34th Avenue in Jackson Heights and how that's been used. So to answer your question, I think there are particular streets right now that are being used. I think that they are not the limits as to the only streets that we could push this for, but I think they are examples of opportunities. We also have Shore Boulevard, which has been beautiful, having been closed off to cars and should be kept that way.
Okay. In terms of many of your, concepts, free MTA fares, another one, of course, is, which we haven't touched on, is Wall Street taxation to, rebuild NYCHA and fix that up. Critics will say, well, where's the money going to come from for this? They're going to say, well, New York State is in a big hole. What would you say to critics that put that in front of you?
I think that what I would say to them is that, if you look at the history of New York State politics, it's in times of financial crisis is when we have often emerged with a shared sense of sacrifice. And it is not unprecedented to increase taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers in times of crisis, because there's an understanding that those who have the most, it is incumbent upon them to share with those who have the least. And And that is really what I and what we are proposing. So when people ask, how will we pay for transit, or how will we pay for NYCHA, or how will we pay for any host of the large-scale legislation that we're pushing? Because I think the grandest legislation and visions are those that will require revenue. My answer to them is we will pay for it through taxation, and it will be fair taxation, it will be progressive taxation. So for example, right now, if you look at New York State's tax system, it is very regressive. People in the bottom quintile are actually paying the most with regards to taxing of their income than people in the top 1%. And that is because sales tax is very regressive and targets people. The poorer you are, the more you are targeted by sales tax versus the wealthiest in our society. And so there are many ways in which you can capture additional revenue that would bring our state in line with a fair and more progressive system. One that I would really focus on is income tax. I believe that we need to raise income taxes on people earning more than $150,000 a year.
Okay.
Right now, our top income tax bracket is 1 million. I think that we need to create additional top income tax brackets. I think that if you make 1 million, 5 million, or 10 million, those are very different sums and deserve to be taxed differently, and even 100 million. And I think that if you make $150,000 a year, you should be taxed at a different amount than somebody who makes 90, and you should also be taxed less than somebody who makes $800,000 a year. And if you implement these, these tax policy changes, which we will be proposing, you would be able to raise about $14 billion. And that just so happens to be the amount that we are projected to be in the hole for the next fiscal year.
Right.
Now, this is a proposal that is not created just to answer these critics or to get the exact number that will meet the exact problem. It is a proposal that is in line with creating a state that has a progressive taxation system. Because right now it is not progressive. And right now our taxation system is a hallmark of a bygone era when we had Republican or conservative executives and governors, regardless of their party affiliation, who have pushed to cut taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers and increase the burden on the poorest. And that is something that we must flip entirely.
Okay. Now, Zohran, do you think that we have a population that is loyal to New York, that won't say, hey, Zohran's putting my taxes up, I'm heading out? And what do you make of these critics that say, well, we live in such a mobile society that put my taxes up, I'm out of here? What do you think? What are your thoughts on those arguments and people with that attitude?
I would first say welcome back to those critics, because they're always here, and it's very fun to see them once again whenever there's a conversation regarding taxation. In 2010, I think it was 2010, although you can correct me, there was a push for the millionaires tax, and we heard the same arguments, right? Which is that we will lose millionaires, they will leave, there are people who, in this mobile society, all the things that you've said.
Yeah.
And today we have 83% more millionaires than we did then. And, I think that we often hear this discourse, and yet when we actually do the research, the comptroller put out a report that showed that working class people and retirees are the most likely to move. Millionaires are actually the least. And, we talk about,
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Why would that be?
Well, I think because millionaires, I think because of the fact that people are moving are people who are being priced out in a real way. And increased taxation is not pricing you out of your ability to afford your home. It's just taking away, profit that you would otherwise have. And what I mean by that is that this taxation will not be the difference of whether or not someone can afford their mortgage.
Right.
And I think what also this discourse ignores is that New Jersey has a higher income tax rate than New York. California has a higher income tax rate than New York. New York State is number 1 in income inequality, but number 9 in income tax rate. But the way these critics discuss these proposals, it's as if it's unprecedented and has no comparative legislation anywhere in this country. And so what I would say, beyond saying welcome back to them to the discussion, is to point these facts and figures out. Because I think that it's very important that we ground this conversation in reality and not simply imagined fears that so often determine the discourse that we have about potential legislation.
Right, okay. Yeah, I mean, the narrative is one that's gone on for many years, that taxation will lead to people leaving. I mean, even Cuomo's been saying that himself and been very vocal about it. Okay, last topic, education. You talk about, schools being segregated. A lot of black and brown kids don't get to go to the better public schools. Can you just tell us a little bit about your, viewpoint and what you would advocate for in Albany in that area?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important that when I go to Albany, and when many of us do, that we will not only play defense, which is very important to do in this time when the governor is proposing, 20% budget cut to education, on top of the freeze, which is basically like a 5% cut on its own because of inflation. Not only push back against that, but to have a positive vision, which so many advocates and organizers have been pushing for, as well as their allies in the legislature. And what I mean by that is that, look, we have to realize that before we think about additional cuts, at this moment in time, we are 48th in the country in the rankings with regards to education equity. And what that means is disparity in spending between wealthy and poor districts. Right now, our wealthiest school districts are outspending our highest need and poorest schools by about $10,000 per student. And this is not a separate discussion from taxing the wealthy. A lot of this is a result of cuts in revenue, especially by Pataki in the 90s, that led to localities having to pick up the burden from the state. And so when you shift, that responsibility, it then creates more of the more spending happening at locality level than ever before. So what I would push for is to remedy this in the way that it needs to be done, and that means not only right, the difference between equal funding and equitable funding, right? Bringing money to those that need it the most, and ensuring that we are not cutting and starving the districts that are serving the highest need and poorest students, but that we are giving them funding in a way that they have not been given before. And I think when you think about the campaign for fiscal equity, the landmark, struggle and historic win, which the governor still refuses to honor by funding our highest need schools to the tune of what courts have determined that they need. That is the first thing we can do is push our governor into compliance with that. And, this is a time when we must not settle for crumbs. We really have to look at the crises we have been facing, many of which predate this pandemic.
Okay. One of the education thing, though, that I noticed, I used to work for Newsday as a reporter out there, and I used to be staggered that you'd get one little local town that would have an enormous amount of money per child, and the next one over would be starved for money per child, and I'd be thinking they're only a couple of miles away. What's going on here? How would you fix that, so to speak? I mean, you touched on it there. I mean, if you're in like New York City, you don't have more money going to Queens than Brooklyn. It's supposed to be spread out evenly. So how would you handle that on a state basis?
Yeah, I think at the state basis, outside of New York City, a lot of our state education funding in towns and places outside of the city is determined by property taxes. And so what I would seek to do is rip up that connection. I do not think that the property taxes of a zip code determine how much funding is driven into education. And that's why I think that we have to have really a statewide push for funding that is, that seeks to remedy the inequalities of that neighborhood, as opposed to use the inequalities of the neighborhood as a foundation for how funding is distributed and allocated.
Okay. All right. Well, Zohran, thank you for your time today.